Welcome to episode 7 of Profiling Key Figures in the Biblical Womanhood Movement. Today I will be profiling Dorothy Patterson. Dorothy Patterson is a key pillar in what I would consider to be formal biblical womanhood, or the female side of evangelical gender complementarianism. In this series, I have talked about the biblical womanhood movement as a religious reaction to feminist theory. And as we've seen, it grew up kind of in parallel with second wave feminism. You first start seeing it in the early 60s, right at the time when second wave feminism begins to be a presence in American society. Now, at first, this movement was driven by isolated individuals who came from pretty different religious backgrounds. We had Protestant evangelicals like Maribel Morgan or Mary Pride, but we also had Helen Andelin, who was Mormon, and we had Phyllis Schlafly, who was Catholic. So it wasn't really until the late 80s and early 90s that evangelicals began to organize against feminism. And by far the most important institution that comes out of that organization process is the Council on Biblical Manhood and Womanhood, or CBMW. This organization was founded in 1987 under the leadership of John Piper, and it included really a who's who of conservative evangelicals at the time, including Paige and Dorothy Patterson. The formalized gender theory that the Council on Biblical Manhood and Womanhood came up with is called complementarianism. The architects of complementarianism wanted to frame male authority and female submission as a matter of gender complementarity rather than the traditional rationale for gender hierarchy, which was just simply female inferiority. Since its inception, complementarianism has tried to keep gender hierarchy but discard the baggage of female inferiority that comes with it. Even though the way that I have defined the biblical womanhood movement, it predates formal complementarianism, I will, from this point in history on, refer to biblical manhood and womanhood and complementarianism pretty much coterminously because that is what complementarian writers do. Both Paige and Dorothy Patterson were charter members of the Council on Biblical Manhood and Womanhood, and they were both included in the Council's 1991 book, Recovering Biblical Manhood and Womanhood. Pattersons had a very mutually beneficial relationship with the Council for Biblical Manhood and Womanhood. Dorothy Patterson particularly heavily promotes CBMW, and CBMW in turn heavily promotes Dorothy Patterson. And that relationship continues until about 2018 and 2019 when the Pattersons experienced their very dramatic, scandalous fall from grace, which we will cover a little bit later on in the video. The fact that the biblical womanhood movement is formalizing and organizing means that Dorothy Patterson has, as I mentioned, the opportunity to hold a lot more institutional power than the women who we have profiled before. Phyllis Schlafly did hold some institutional power in the political sphere, even though she was always kind of on the margins of that. But this is the first time that we've seen a woman hold this kind of institutional power in the evangelical authority structures. And yet, along with that institutional power comes a lot of institutional control. So I would say that somebody like Phyllis Schlafly or Maribel Morgan actually had a lot more agency in their work. Her ability to wield power and influence in these spheres was very conditional on her towing the party line, and she was actually really groomed for this role, as we will see. As we saw with Phyllis Schlafly, Dorothy Patterson was a woman who had an unusually high level of formal education, an unusually high level of formal education for anyone, not just for a woman. She had a master's in theology and two doctorates. She had a doctorate in ministry and a doctorate in theology. As Dorothy tells it, it was actually her husband who pushed her into higher learning. She says, quote, "My husband is responsible for my studies in theology. I did not have the inclination to do it. My health challenges and responsibilities in our home as wife and mother just pulled me away from an interest in the pursuit of graduate and postgraduate studies. I owe my graduate education to my husband's encouragement and determination to put me through these programs in order that I could be a better helper to him, especially in the area of woman to woman teaching." And frankly, having read some of her writing, I can actually pretty easily believe that she was not the one who was pushing to get this level of education. Despite having a pretty impressive stack of degrees, Dorothy Patterson's writing is not especially academically rigorous. Her two major pieces of writing are a women's Bible study that she was the head editor for, that was published in 2017. And then she wrote a book in 2003 called Where's Mom? The High Calling of Wives and Mothers. And this book was really just an expansion of the essay that she wrote in Recovering Biblical Manhood and Womanhood. Dorothy Patterson's primary message is that women's lives ought to revolve around their home and their family. She calls homemaking a divine assignment that is assigned to the woman and not to the man. This is a quote from Where's Mom? "How sad for a woman to try to build her life on the notion that she is going to pursue whatever momentarily happens to gratify her needs socially, emotionally, physically, or professionally. Although the duties of wife and mother may lay claim, the Lord warned that the desires of personal ambition and success in the public or professional service can take hold." So she's definitely teaching that women belong in the home, and if they have any desire to pursue anything outside of the home, it is only because they are selfish and not really in line with God's vision for them. As with many of the figures, the female figures in the biblical manhood and womanhood movement, we really can't talk about Dorothy Patterson without talking about her husband. And there is a lot to talk about with Paige Patterson, but I will try to be brief. Paige Patterson, along with Paul Pressler, was one of the two main architects of the conservative resurgence in the Southern Baptist denomination. The conservative resurgence was a highly organized, top down, really almost political campaign to reform the denomination um, along more conservative lines. Paige Patterson is at the center of the conservative resurgence, not just in terms of the Southern Baptist Convention, which he was the president of from 1998 to 2000, but also and especially within Southern Baptist academia. He was the president of three major Baptist academic institutions: Criswell College, Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary, and most recently, Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary. Paige and Dorothy Patterson were kind of a complementarian power couple. At Southwestern, Dorothy Patterson was referred to as the First Lady of the seminary. And Paige really does seem to have seen her as his right hand man, or I guess you could say right hand woman. They both held significant institutional power, but they did so in a conspicuously hierarchical way. Dorothy would regularly refer to herself as Dr. Patterson's helpmeet and stressed at all times that she was operating under her husband's leadership, and this does seem to have been true. It's very hard to tell how much of what Dorothy Patterson accomplished was coming from her and what she really believed and wanted, and how much of it she was doing simply at the direction of her husband. Dorothy Patterson ends up being on the faculty at Southwestern as a professor of theology and women's studies. In 2007, the seminary enrolled a new Bachelor of Arts in Humanities program that had a special concentration in homemaking. So this degree program included things like learning how to sew, how to do interior decorating, how to cook, how to be hospitable, and naturally, Dorothy was at the helm. Under Dorothy's leadership, Southwestern was able to continue to recruit female students and to earn their tuition dollars while aggressively promoting complementarian gender roles that would have made it very hard for female graduates to go out and find paid ministry work. And Dorothy was really the key to making this all work. Dorothy Patterson stood as a symbol of all that a complementarian woman could be. She was a devoted wife and mother and homemaker, and yet she held great power and influence in the evangelical world. Somewhere, probably in the basement of some building at Southwestern, there exist two stained glass windows capturing the likeness of Paige and Dorothy Patterson. They were meant to be part of a 69 window set that would commemorate the key figures in the conservative resurgence. This whole stained glass window project was Dorothy Patterson's brainchild. In 2019, the windows were removed from where they had been installed in the chapel. This was following the firing of Paige and Dorothy Patterson over the mishandling of a rape allegation. Cover up of this rape situation turned out to be the last straw in a long line of very troubling revelations about misogyny from Paige Patterson. So, the mishandling of the rape allegation and the cover up that both he and Dorothy participated in at this point were part of a larger pattern. In the year 2024, the Pattersons' fall from grace is pretty much complete. Nobody really wants to partner with them or publicly admit to having accepted influence from them. The quiet removal of these stained glass windows of Paige and Dorothy Patterson is a very appropriate symbol for how complementarianism and really evangelical culture as a whole deals with things in its past. I have the 2006 edition of Recovering Biblical Manhood and Womanhood. So that is the edition that still has the two essays from Paige and Dorothy Patterson. If you look at the most recent edition, those essays have simply been removed without comment. So there is this pattern with CBMW of not wanting to own their history or learn from their history. But charitably, Dorothy Patterson's life was, to say the least, paradoxical. I think she would probably agree with that. But put less charitably, her life was really kind of contradictory and hypocritical. For a lot of her life, she worked outside the home, collecting a paycheck and presumably a pension. So she had the kind of personal financial security that most women who do commit to full time homemaking do not have. By anyone's definition, Dorothy Patterson was a career woman. But ironically, her career mostly consisted of telling other women that they shouldn't have careers.